Thank you everyone for coming to our session tonight. This is It Starts with Soil, How to Prepare Your Garden for Planting. And we want to thank everyone for tuning in for the virtual session tonight. This virtual session, in case you're not aware, is brought to you by Wild Ones Greater Cleveland. If you haven't heard of Wild Ones before, or if you've only recently heard about Wild Ones, because I know we do have some folks who we met at the Akron Zoo Earth Day event this past weekend. Wild Ones is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting environmentally sound landscaping practices to preserve biodiversity through preservation, restoration, and establishment of native plant communities. If you are attending this session, you're probably already following us on social media or receiving our chapter update emails, but make sure you follow our Facebook and Instagram pages for information on future events like this one. So tonight we are honored to welcome Jen Johnson. She is one of the co-owners of Native Roots Incorporated, along with her sister Sonia. Native Roots is a native plant nursery with operations in Richfield, Ohio, and Mineral Wells, West Virginia. Native Plants was begun in 2011 and is focused on being a native plant resource for homeowners and businesses concerned about ecological restoration. Jen, who's going to present for us tonight, earned her Bachelor's of Science in Chemical Engineering and a Certificate of Environmental Studies from the University of Akron in 2007. Jen has worked as an engineer and manager in the chemical industry for over a decade before switching careers in 2020 to teach 8th grade science. Jen switched to substitute teaching just earlier this year so that she can focus on expanding the inventory and services of Native Roots. So Jen, I'm now going to turn it over to you so that you can share your knowledge with us tonight.
Thank you, Stephanie. Well, I'm happy to partner with Wild Ones on this presentation, and I'm honored to be the one to kick off the presentation and starting with soil, how to prepare your garden for planting and restoration. Because it does make a little bit of a difference in how we consider the soil and how we prepare. So as mentioned, I'm the VP of Native Roots Inc., a partner with my sister Sonia. And we partnered with Wild Ones last year because we really loved what they were doing and saw that they were moving and shaking in the community. And we were, it's inspiring and energizing for businesses like us to have people sharing the business of educating. So let's get started. So before I talk about soil, I want to talk about why native gardening is a trend. Over the last 12 years of being in business, we've had all of these reasons described as why people are turning to natives. And so some of these are probably your reasons. The couple that really have to do with soil is our problem areas. That's one of the ways that native plants can shine, because cultivated plants are not, I guess, they're focused more on sunny things that maintain a neat border or tidy habit, right? So oftentimes, if you or somebody has a clay area in your yard or shady area in your yard that things aren't doing well, you've been looking for natives, for a long time. Drought tolerance, moisture retention, and erosion control obviously have to do with soil, and natives are well. And then, as we get closer to modern day, the issues have become so obvious to so many people, loss of wildlife, loss of pollinators, the connection of our food security to pollinators, and climate change. And so there's a real strong trend towards regenerative land management. And that doesn't just mean farming. So it's become more of a movement, not just a trend, because the reasons are survival. So you can join the movement in your own way. We're at a unique time where scientific discovery abounds and is magnified by technology. What we can learn and how quickly we can learn it is constantly changing, and we have access. So with the internet, we have access to cutting edge science. And I think in order to be highly successful, we have to start to think differently, and we have to go back to our basic science, back from middle school and high school, to understand how interconnected and complex the systems are and how they work together and how that fits in to restoring and planting in our yard. And then, of course, how our actions without that knowledge has put our residency somewhat at risk here, maintaining the same quality of life. So there's a lot of environmental issues that create urgency, which is why we're all here today. But we also know that the complexity of the issue creates room for politics, and that's frustrating for all of us. The energy of these programs, things like pollinator pathways and things like that, are helping us move past, the stagnation of, government assistance in getting things accomplished. And we can't wait for that anyway. So I encourage you all today to start with one soil-based or land-based restoration goal. And as you attend these seminars going forward, that you add to those as you learn more. There's lots of tools to help you, even though it's a little bit of an overwhelming problem at times. But like I said, there's lots of tools, and we'll talk about that. So I consider mutualisms, or the interconnected relationships in nature and humans, humans interacting with nature, as kind of the cogs of the ecosystem. So the wheels and the gears that keep things turning and productive. And Doug Tallamy, which everybody is familiar with, probably. And if you're not familiar with Doug Tallamy, look for one of his books. He has a few books out there. They're amazing. And he's really good at painting a picture of how interconnected we are. Even if you've been a lifelong student of the sciences, you can learn a ton from the science that he and his students are doing and the books that he's written about it to illustrate the problem. Here is his one of his resources, Homegrown National Park, which is to put half of the earth, saving it for nature. And as you can see from the statistics below, the government can't really help anyway. They only own 12% of the land. So with almost 80% of land in private ownership, we residents, landowners, we have to be the ones to take this step. The Pollinator Pathway Initiative, just trying to refragment the disconnected ecosystems. And of course, you've probably seen a lot of things, but restoring saved species. We know that monarch butterflies, travel a long ways and migrate long distances, and so they can travel pretty far to their food. But there's other species that cannot travel as far. So, of course, Wild Ones has a lot of great resources. So if you're not familiar with all the resources, one of the things we like to point people to who may be overwhelmed are these garden designs that are, up on the website and on the national website and available. Obviously, they may not be from Cleveland, but many scientists at this point in our, fragmentation and, climate change issues as a consideration really suggest considering the eastern deciduous forest as one habitat, and all those plants are pretty close to native in most of those states. And perhaps assisting migration isn't a bad idea as well. So pollinators.org puts it this way, and I agree: private landowners that landscape with native plants play a critical role in restoring overall biodiversity and bringing back pollinators. They are key to help bridge the gap in our fragmented landscape. So you guys are probably all here because you want to do native plants and you want some information. I'm probably going to give you a little more information than you bargained for, but I want you to understand soil is the foundation, but plants are so interconnected. I can't talk about soil without the plants. So your yard, is your soil base with whatever vegetation you have and structures. What is your yard's potential for ecosystem services? Well, we know about wildlife habitat and food supply. That's why a lot of us are doing this, or maybe what got our interest to begin with. Improved biodiversity, which is health of an ecosystem and its function, pest management, temperature regulation, small water cycle support from vegetation, stormwater pollution prevention, erosion prevention, and carbon sequestration. So when I talk about native plants, I start with a framework for ecological restoration in your garden. We're not going to go through my whole framework, but we're going to talk about the base, which is soil. So I'm probably going to bounce around a little bit between basic science for those of you, that haven't looked at a, geology book or studied soil recently, or maybe since 8th grade or something. Soil horizons are something you'll see referred to in, if you look up anything about soil, which, like I said, you can look up so many things nowadays. The key is to understanding the terminology or the vocabulary. So soil horizons are the layers, beginning with the bedrock at the bottom, because it was here first. It becomes partly weathered, and you get fragmentation, and then deposited materials. Alluvial layers are where things have been deposited, like perhaps by moving water, and things like that. And then your topsoil, which contains rock pieces and humus, which is the above layer. So the humus is, where the very top, the compost, right? And in a forest, the humus layer is really rich and thick, but like on a lawn, maybe not so much. So how does soil form? We talked about the rock fragments. You guys probably all remember sedimentary rock, metamorphic rock, igneous rock, the weathering and transportation of sediments that are breaking off of rock surfaces create part of soil. Also, the different earth systems, such as the lithosphere, which is the crust and mantle, and includes soil, the hydrosphere, which is water, and the atmosphere are constantly cycling things. So for example, we have the biosphere, which is, living things. Living things die, they end up decomposed. And then some of those minerals from decomposed materials end up in the water through groundwater flow. And some of those minerals end up turned into new forms and evaporated out into the atmosphere and then redeposited, either taken in by plants or animals or other processes. So the soil microbiome is kind of a new idea. We've all talked about, the chemistry and the physical makeup of soils, but it turns out that one of the cutting edge things about soil is that we now understand that the soil is to plants like the gut is to humans. And just like your gut microbiome, probably a lot of people have heard that, you want a good balance of, the different bacteria in your gut, so that something doesn't go out of control and make you feel unwell in one way or another. That's the same with soils. So they learned this about 20 to 30 years ago when they were studying pathogens, and it was believed that the things that were living in soils were all pathogens, bad microbes. And through trying to study those, they learned that no, the soil is actually alive. It's a microbiome full of hundreds of thousands or millions of different algae and fungi and bacteria and small organisms and larger organisms like earthworms, and then the creatures that move along the ground. So what happens in the soil microbiome is nutrient cycling. So chemicals end up broken down in the soil from those rock fragments in soil, and allow the nutrients that are in them, let's say calcium or potassium, to be put into a form that can be taken up by plants. Just like what our gut does when we eat food, it breaks it down so that the chemicals are in a form that our body can take up and use. The other thing that they have documented happening is production of phytochemicals by microbes and fungi in the soil that are used by plants during times of stress, like drought, when they can't produce those chemicals themselves because they're doing their best just to stay alive.
Hey, Jen, really quickly, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but it looks like we've got a couple people waiting in the waiting room for the meeting. So if you take this out of presentation mode, if you could let them in, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you.
And I forgot, yes, I forgot that I was, let's see here. Admit all. All right. No worries. Thank you for.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And welcome to those of you that were just joining. I apologize. I got to presenting and didn't realize I was in control to let you in. So now that you're all in, you missed just a little bit of my science, whatever teaching, but there's plenty more to come, and there'll be a recording of this at some point for available to you. So we're talking about some of the functions that the microbes and fungi and bacteria in the soil provide as a living microbiome in the soil, nutrient cycling, producing phytochemicals to help plants, improving soil structure and water infiltration and storage. This is one of the largest benefits of a healthy microbiome in your soil. It actually creates soil structure. And we'll talk about that on the next slide just a little bit more. Controlling pathogens with a good biodiverse, microbiome, and sequestering carbon. So there's a few movements to restore soils as a solution to climate change and reduce food security. I just want to mention, if you're interested in learning more specifically about that, Kiss the Ground is a documentary. You can get a free educational version on their website. And there's also a Netflix version with Woody Harrelson as the narrator. So that's fun. And also the 4P1000 initiative, which is mentioned in that documentary, which was started by the French Ministry of Agriculture, I believe, and is a potential solution to increase sequestration of soils by regenerative land management, which basically means taking care of soils. So to add some more science, the biogeochemical cycles. So you guys know about the Earth systems, the atmosphere and the hydrosphere that cycles water throughout the atmosphere and the land and the water. But the microbes in the soil in particular are a huge part of cycling between the biological and chemical processes on Earth. And they are the big reason why things that are in the atmosphere end up in the soil and then end up in plants and then end up in us. So one of the things that is happening is with loss of focus or loss of understanding of how soils work, we've allowed soils to become degraded to a point where we're all noticing, and it's talked about a lot, we have lower nutrient values in our food because the soils don't have the nutrients because the soils are not living anymore in many cases. So they're just being fed by chemical application, which is then bad for soils as well. I want to mention we talked about increasing carbon sequestration. Mycorrhizae fungi is one of the ones you've probably heard about. It does a lot of good things for plants. But one of the things that it also is found to do is synthesize, along with the exudates, which means the liquids that the roots release in the soil. They mix with that and create a carbon glue called glomalin, which was discovered in 1994, just to give you an idea of how new this science is. That is what they believe creates the majority of porosity in topsoil, is that carbon glue. So remember, porosity, it's the pore space in between soil particles that allows water to infiltrate, among other things, and creates storage for storage of water. So there's obviously a large opportunity for improving carbon sequestration because we aren't focusing on this, right? So while they are focusing currently in agriculture, as a landowner, you should also be aware that you can help too. And then really the basic thing with soil health is just like gut health. It's having the right balance, you know, the right chemical components and the right microbes going on all at the same time. So, so it sounds a little complex. So what are the state of soils and what's a landowner's opportunity? So a recent article, you can read lots and lots about the state of soils in the United States and across the globe, but they're generally declining. In the United States, if you look at a global, like most of the globe, it's the states are in declining fertility. A 2021 article from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences recently was able to study the soil using, you know, technological imaging of some sort, as they can do now in science, and determines 24 to 46% of topsoil has been completely lost from the US Corn Belt. So what all states that includes, I can't remember. I know Iowa was talked about a lot, but generally the Midwest, and that's way more, even at the low end, than they thought had been lost. So, you know, back from the early days when we were cutting those fields, there was some estimates of, you know, a foot deep or more of topsoil in some places, rich humusy topsoil. And we've certainly degraded a lot of that. So what they also found in the article was that tillage, so not just general erosion, you know, maybe from leaving the land barren, but tillage in particular was indicated as a significant factor in the loss of topsoil. So in our own yards, we should at least consider, you know, current best practices for regenerative agriculture in our own land management, which is a real challenge because we already know that restoration is not going to be an easy task in a lot of cases, depending on what your restoration goal is. And we'll talk about that. It does sometimes when you're not using the easy methods, when you're not, you know, spraying with herbicide or spraying with pesticide, when you're not tilling, yeah, it takes patience, you know, and some more labor perhaps, but if not more labor, more patience. Investigating, you know, going out and checking things out on your property, experimenting and collaborating. This is definitely not something we want to do in a vacuum. We want to talk to people and we want to learn from each other. So the article that I referenced was commented on by a article in Yale University's online publication. And what I appreciated was really the picture, to be honest, which really shows the, you know, what I would envision as the living soil beneath the plants and that interconnectedness. But below the surface of the prairie lay a universe of soil organisms that has also been sacrificed quietly and invisibly over the years. So that's not to make you cry over the soil organisms that have been lost, but just to understand that there has been loss and we don't have to allow it to continue. So when you're preparing a site for restoration, these are important things. I want to just make sure that you understand our soil is a heritage item. It's something that has high value, and we could debate whether it's renewable or non-renewable. But I think renewable being not within our lifetime, can we regenerate it to that same degree, then it's definitely non-renewable. So let's get to looking at your soil, okay? And when you're in your yard, I'm a big systems person, that's part of my engineering training, but also just being in nature and understanding the interconnectedness. We need to work with the system we have if we want to have ultimate success. So let's understand it. Part of that is observing what grows around you, what trees in particular, shrubs. Hold on one second, I'm gonna let a couple more people in maybe here. Okay, so observing what grows around you. So for example, if you have sycamores in your yard, You probably already know, you probably have a stream or something. But I live actually in Mineral Wells, West Virginia. And on the way to my house, there's this up stretch that has sycamores all the way to the top of the hill almost. And obviously there's a spring or something that's coming out of that hillside. So the trees that you have around you, the plants that you have around you can be indicators of the type of habitat you have and the type of soils that you have. There's a really cool tool. It's not necessarily the easiest thing. I definitely would say do it on a laptop and not on an iPad, because you have to select an area. But the U.S. Geological Survey Soil Web Survey is an online tool in any state. I mean, it's a national thing. You can find out the specific soil in your immediate area, which is very cool, I think. Also, soil sampling around your property can tell you the texture, the components, sand, silt, clay, size of the particles, the pH, and other chemistry in your soil. Post-rain observation. So this is one of the things that you can use when it rains. Where does the water sit? And then how long does it stay? So this is one of the ways you can tell if maybe a rain garden is a good idea for you, or perhaps I found I don't have a lot of standing water in my property, but when I was digging in the soil, one area was almost always wet, even though I don't see it coming out. And so there's a spring there. So recognizing springs, especially if you live on slopes, basically what happens is if you have a sandstone layer that holds water, let's say, that's sitting on top of a clay layer, and so it travels through the sandstone layer but can't get through the clay layer because it's very tightly compact, and it doesn't go through very quickly. It'll slide out the side of the hill, and that's where you get a spring. Also, where you have low areas that are close to groundwater, you can also have springs. Also, look at where you have invasive species. So probably on your property's edge, you may have some invasive species, when the lawn was put in, or things that people did to expand the lawn. But basically, it's an indication of where the site has been disturbed. And it's just one other thing you can note on your property. So how do we keep a healthy soil microbiome on our site? The most important thing is to keep it covered at all times to prevent erosion and maintain moisture. Cover crops that winter kill are best. Cover crops that don't winter kill, you need to be prepared for. So if that's something you're into, that's definitely like an advanced stage of cover cropping. But cover crops or native annuals can be a really nice way to get soil covered. Like if you do a big restoration and realize you don't have enough time or energy to cover the whole thing, if you spread cover crops that will winter kill, or native annuals such as Bidens or partridge pea, they're easy to pull, and they're not gonna dig in, roots that are gonna last for, the next season and get bigger. Whereas perennial ground covers that spread, such as blue mistflower, or things that spread in clusters, such as golden Alexanders, and have a nice border or foliage, can also be really good cover crops to get stuff on the ground quickly, things that spread, or if you like something taller, obedient plants. So obviously there's a time to till and there's a time not to, and you have to make these decisions. I've definitely tilled things, and when you're doing restoration, sometimes you have to you have to make something, you have to do some destruction, I guess. So you just have to decide what you're comfortable with. If you can avoid tilling, great. And also try to avoid driving over areas or walking a lot in areas and compacting the soil. Add organic matter as needed, or restore with layers. So we talked about forests have healthy soil because everything that falls ends up decomposing right there. The ground cover holds everything in place, and the soils are constantly being regenerated. But in our open lawns and our side beds and this and that, that's not happening. In fact, we don't want that to happen because that would look really messy if we just left all the leaves laying there. So we have to amend. We have to make up for having taken out those layers within the ecosystem. Avoid pesticides as much as possible. They're bad for soil microbes and also our own gut microbes. So nutrient-based, add nutrients based on soil testing, including physical, chemical, and biological, if possible, or if you desire. It's just another piece of the puzzle that's starting to be available, but it's not mainstream. Adding chemicals without testing can make things worse. Increase plant diversity to increase soil microbial diversity. So what you're going to do to prepare your soil is going to depend on where you're restoring. So I use this slide when I'm talking about where to plant natives, but it works in this case as well. So if you're doing borders, if you're just going to restore your woodland edge or your wet edge of your property, then, well, especially a woodland edge, you don't necessarily need to amend the soil. You may need to do some invasive species removal though. If you're going to expand that edge now into the turf grass, then you have to get into deciding what to do about the turf grass, and we'll talk about that. Rain gardens, the same thing. Most likely that's an area that maybe the grass doesn't do great, or it grows like crazy, who knows, right? Depends on your yard. Creating intimate woodland rooms. So that's just another, if you're going to be basically restoring a woodland area, you know, with the layers of canopy, from canopy to ground or even understory to ground, then you're going to be creating a space that's going to amend itself over time. And so maybe if money is a concern, you don't necessarily need to put in compost, especially because these plants, native plants in particular, are adapted to our soils, which aren't always woodlands. Same with prairies. You have to deal with turf grass, wet edges and slopes. And so if you're putting plants into your existing beds, there's not a huge need to amend with topsoil or do amendments if your existing plants are doing fine. You're most likely you're mulching already and your soil is pretty good. So you know your soil in those areas. You really don't have to do anything else except decide where to put the plants. However, we get a lot more questions than you would think about people planting in a container. So perennial plants most of them don't do well in a container in the house, but we get that question sometimes too. But on a porch, they can do fine. And for people that can only pick one plant, a keystone species, such as a goldenrod or an aster or a sunflower, although sunflowers can have really deep root systems, so you'd have to have a pretty big pot or be selective, are good for putting in a pot. And if you were putting soil into the pot, you don't want to put all compost, right? It's got to somewhat mimic the soil that plant would have grown. It has to have a little bit of other things. And so, you know, I recommend picking good soils. In Cleveland, you have Rust Belt Riders, which is a great company that, you know, recycles, you know, waste and turns it into, you know, soil and that kind of stuff. So that's a good option for your pots. So when you go out to your site, you decided where you're going to work. Let's identify what's there first. Okay. So if at all possible, let's try to get away from the idea of just spraying everything and starting with a blank slate. Okay. If that's necessary, it's necessary. And I'm not judging anyone for that. I'll show you, we've done jobs like that too. But if you notice that you have a ton of really neat stuff from taking a look or like letting it go for, you know, a season and see what woodies come up, woodies being like shrubs and trees. We allowed an area to kind of go, you know, we didn't mow it down last year, and the shrubs, the things that popped up were a sweet crab apple and some other cool stuff. So, so it's really good idea to find out what's there. And you can use iNaturalist if you're not familiar with it. It's an app. where you can be a citizen scientist. You can record observations anywhere you're at by uploading a picture and getting help with identification. And then that can become part of studied science. If you don't want your information shared, they do have something called the Seek app. But this can help you, one, identify the good things you have in your yard, but also the invasives, okay? So everybody, I think, is probably familiar with invasives, if, you know, and even if it's only dandelions. I love dandelions. They're obviously invasive, but they're here to stay. I just think they're amazing for a lot of reasons. I wouldn't plant them in my garden, but I'm happy to dig them up and use them for things. Bush honeysuckle, you know, Japanese honeysuckle, multiflora rose, reed canary grass, the thistles, Japanese knotweed, you name it. There's a number of nasty grasses that have infiltrated a couple of my beds that I've been watching, like Johnson grass and things like that. So recognizing, learning to identify these things and doing research on how to remove each one is a little bit different. But the easiest thing is to learn what they look like when they're young. And if you've ever, if you have honeysuckle, you've probably learned that way down at the base of the ground, the young honeysuckle leaves are funny looking. They kind of look like oak leaves. That's not what they look like, you know, 2 to 3 leaves above that, and for the rest of their, you know, vining, whatever glory. So most people think, oh, what's this cute plant? Well, that's the time when you want to pull it out, when it's young and you can easily pull it. So learning to identify them young is huge. Disturbed areas must be restored and managed to prevent invasive species. So we have a lot of woodland edge, and there's a few autumn olive on our property, and we have to decide, although it's frustrating, you just want to go and mow them all down. Currently, they are providing cover, you know, habitat for birds. I have an eastern towhee that's hanging out beside my house now. We could see him all the time. He doesn't seem afraid of us, but he hangs out in the multiflora rose. and so I'm obviously not going to restore that area this year. Because when we pull it out, what we've decided to hit is this humongous autumn olive. And the reason we've taken so long to pull it out is it takes up a huge area. And when we pull that out, all kinds of autumn olive babies are probably going to come up. Anytime you disturb the soil, you help with some of breaking dormancy of the seeds that are in the soil. So when you remove plants from your garden that are open pollinated, you know, that their seeds are viable, you know, like native plants. If you decide to move something and it's dropped seeds over a couple of years, chances are you'll get a couple babies popping up. Disturbing soil helps seeds to break dormancy and germinate. So when I pull that autumn olive out, we've got to know what we're putting in there. You know, we want to put shrubs, and we want to make sure that, you know, we monitor for a couple of years. So leave it be is not a good restoration strategy. Leave it be is fine if you're willing to monitor that area, and as you see invasive species, you know, coming in, that you deal with them early, because if you don't do that, your treatment methods start to diminish, either heavy labor or lots of spraying or both, multi-year process and costly to deal with. So when you go to prepare the site, you've identified your invasives, where you're going to start. Consider size, truly. Think big, of course. You know, you want to have a big vision that you're moving towards, but start small. Break that down into a smaller piece. You know, pick one part of that to focus on. You know, I would recommend, and this is totally against my nature. My husband would probably laugh at me if he was listening. But I've learned from example, you can go big, but there are things you got to do to make sure invasives aren't creeping in your lack of time to manage that large area. Otherwise, you'll just really regret it. So define the edge, that adds a depth and a sense of boundary. And for those that are really concerned about tidiness, or at least want to make it something that their neighbors aren't hating on, defining the edges is really important, which can be a challenge. So mowing the edge works fine for most people, but some people want a little tidier look. In that case, a paved, edge around it, or a paved walkway around it. We recently did, or a couple of years ago, we did a wetland restoration in the back of a lady's yard who her yard used to be a wetlands, and you could look on the old topo maps, and it was an old wetland right there between her house and the two neighbors. And now she's putting in an even more substantial walkway because she wants to make sure that it stays, that it looks good, right? So that it gets to stay. Wavy edges are easier to mow than sharp corners. Mowed, we already talked about mowed edges, but so yeah, just you see a lot of that wavy, ripply look. And you have somebody that mows in your house, so you can talk to them and see whether they agree. How do we remove lawn and how do we deal with invasive species? So when we're talking about turf in particular, and in the other areas, there's a couple different methods. So let's look at those. Lasagna gardening or sheet mulching. And I have to be honest, I don't have a lot of time to do this many layers, but I have seen it done, and I have seen it done successfully. You can really truncate this. So like I said, I put in huge areas and then, leave room to throw in stock plants so that I have a seed collection source. So one of the ways that I dealt with invasives creeping up in between my planted spots, obviously compost is one of those ways, but compost, unless it's like 4 to 6 inches, it lasts. I mean, but if you have a major invasion of stuff underneath that you're putting that on top of, it's not going to last for long. You're going to have things popping up, and then you're going to constantly be in there pulling them. But cardboard, just adding cardboard, so save all your boxes, lay them out flat, and you can put them around. Like if you plant something in an area, or what happens to me, sometimes I don't get my mulch in time, and the weeds have kind of taken over. So I'll put the cardboard around the plants that I love and leave those exposed, to the air, cover everything else, and throw the mulch on top. And I will tell you what, that makes a huge difference. So if you have a really bad area, adding these extra layers, combining dried leaves, grass, green clippings, if you compost, it's a very similar thing, making sure you have the right, a good mix of green stuff, putting nitrogen in there, and brown stuff, putting carbon in there. For larger areas, heavy duty black plastic, weighed down or pegged down, leaving for 3 to 6 months during the summer, or 2 to 3 months in the summer, or 6 months in the winter. And that's obviously in the summer, you could check it after a month, and if you really don't want to wait, a lot of those things really look dead. But the longer you can leave it, the longer you can make sure to minimize problems down the road. And going back to size, so maybe you want a 1.5 acre prairie, but do you need 1.5 acres right away? Can you start with a 1/4 acre and then expand from there? And one of the cool things about that is you now have a basis of seed source. So you have these things that have returned, the next year, and do really well. And then that fall, you till up the next 1/4 acre and use the seeds from your first 1/4 acre to, seed the second 1/4 acre. So if you're patient, and you can get into a situation where it's not going to be unmanageable. Also, if you are not going to spread seed, and if you're going to have big gaps in your planting while you're waiting for things to fill in, you do want to mulch in some way, whether it's compost or wood chips or something, straw, whatever, hay, that kind of thing. So years back, I mentioned we've had to do this as well, because of the large areas that like parks and that kind of thing have to restore. Sometimes you have to spray, and budget wise, they're not willing to spend more than that. But this was about 2014. It was an Army Corps of Engineers project. They wanted a pollinator garden around this pole. So we went in and sprayed, and marked the boundary. A week or so later, we tilled planted and mulched. And later that year, this is what it looks like. So you can accomplish things quickly. The cool thing about this site, it's small enough they could have done black plastic, but it wasn't what they wanted to do. So you could accomplish this without any chemicals. So what do we need to add? Okay, we've got our soil ready. Do we need to add anything? As I said, if you're, if you just ripped up a forest section and took all the invasives out, that soil is probably pretty decent. There's probably not a lot you need to add, okay? If you had turf grass on it for a long time and nothing's ever been added, compost probably isn't a bad idea. And you can use it to cover your seed in some cases, unless those are seeds that need, light to germinate. But nutrient balance is really just a cycle of inputs, what's going in. So whether we put fertilizer or compost, or whether nature's putting dead carbon materials, and what's coming out being uptaken through plant roots, as nutrients. So the one thing you can always add without ever worrying about anything is carbon in the form of dead plant materials, such as leaves, twigs. Dead logs are really good to put at the back of your garden where, if you don't like the way they look, and then plant things in front of them and they're constantly decomposing and feeding your soil. But also compost and compost teas. But compost, is that decomposed material in a form that looks a little prettier. You can use it as your mulch in some cases. If you're going to apply anything else, I strongly recommend that you test before you apply. Manure is something that you can add relatively safely without worrying about that, as long as, they recommend fall, so that it's not too strong and it has time to break down in the soil before you plant in the spring. But seriously, carbon, compost is a great thing to add without testing, and everything else I strongly recommend testing. So if you have and the reason is because if you have a surplus of a nutrient, let's say nitrogen in the soil, it becomes a risk of polluting soil, water, and air. So when that soil runs off, you're putting excess nitrogen, into the waterways. And also it can create conditions where certain microbes take over and are putting more greenhouse gases into the air as opposed to oxygen and oxygen gas. So, but the surplus can also create a toxic situation for your plants. Deficiency or surplus could also be due to a bad microbial imbalance. And so you could still, even if you found you had a surplus or a deficiency, you may be able to amend that by adding compost, because it might not be in the form that it needs to be detected by the test, which is the form that it needs to be in to be used by the plant. So compost regenerates the microbiome. It also makes weeds easier to pull. So that's one reason, if you don't like having to struggle with weeds, in that first year or so of getting your restoration in place, especially if it's a new one that had invasives in there, adding compost in a thick amount can help with removing the weeds. Cover crops can also amend soil as well as protecting it. Most people know nitrogen fixing plants. Partridge pea is one of those plants. That's a native annual. Nitrogen you can add with green plant materials. So the one thing is with green plant materials, you want to make sure to have at least as much, if not a little more, of the brown materials than the green materials. Okay, and nitrogen also comes with manure. The other things like the phosphorus and potassium, if you have nutrient deficiencies in those areas, again, I recommend compost to begin with, and then maybe retest before you add. And then there's lots of resources out there, including your soil analysis that will come if you take a soil test, or send your soil off for soil testing. So to talk about soil analysis, you can do it to get a baseline, to inform what you put in, to see how well your management plan is, to troubleshoot issues, and to help you select plants. You can do it at home. You can contact your extension office in Cleveland. or, whatever county you're in, or you can contact another lab. For example, if you want biological testing, you'll have to do that. You can do a simple jar test to determine your composition, which is your sand, silt, and clay. So just quickly to remind people, sand, silt, and clay are the components of the soil that are the rock pieces, and they describe the particle size. So this image shows you that sand is more than twice the size of silt, which is more than, like about 10 or more times the size of clay. So particle size distribution determines your soil texture. It impacts porosity. If you have high sand, your soil is well drained but low nutrient. If you have high clay, your soil is high nutrient, probably, but soggy when wet, among other problems, right? There are cool charts out there that can help you determine your soil type based on your percentage of sand, silt, clay. But the one thing I want to say here is you can't change your soil type. You can select plants for your soil type, and you can enrich the organic top layer with compost, but you can't, if you have clay soil, you can't just go add sand on top of it, and that doesn't work. They do not mix that way, and it will actually create potentially more problems. So this is just an example of the standard soil analysis for the OSU extension, which is the university that fosters extension offices. You can see soil pH, the NPKs. You can pay additional fees for some other things like iron, zinc, copper. Find out things like the soil texture and the organic matter in general. And you might justify spending more if you're trying to diagnose a problem that you haven't figured out. Taking samples is something you can watch a number of YouTube videos on, but it really is not hard. So the picture on the right shows a standard soil probe you can buy on Amazon for $20. That's the lowest price I found. If you want to get one that has a foot pedal that you can push down with, which is what I would need, it's like another 100 on top of that for some reason. But you can also just use a little shovel. So you scrape the surface layer away, plant residues, so grass, whatever, leaves. Avoid areas that were burned or where ashes were dumped or compost or manure was stored. You cut into the soil, making a V-shaped hole. And then you're basically trying to, the next 2 points, you're trying to mimic that little round, in this case, on the soil probe, sample. You're going to make it square. So you're going to cut, a 1-inch slice out of your soil section that's 6 to 8 inches deep. And then you're going to cut a 1-inch slice out of that. So you have a 1x1 tube basically of soil. Put that into your sample container that's clean. And if you're going to take other samples, which is recommended, you'll do the same process and add them together, stir them up, take out a cup of soil, let it dry for a couple of days inside, put it in a bag with the information and send it off to the lab. Or Farmer's Almanac has a couple of DIY tests that you can do, including the jar test, which some of you have probably done, where you shake it up and find out what your sand, soil, clay is, but there's also some other things with pH. So really quickly, I just want to, I know we're getting close to the time, but I just want to mention covering the grounds, because there are not a lot of traditional ground covers in native plants, okay? Woodland stonecrop or wild stonecrop is one of the ones that is out there. It's mostly found in the woodlands, but it can survive pretty well in sun. Actually, I've seen it do really well in sun, but also things like the annuals, creeping plants, and some of the things that have low foliage, even if they have taller blooms, or even foot tall ground covers, such as obedient plant. But just reimagining ground covers and making sure that we're covering the soil. So after that, you'll start selecting your plants. So I just want to make you aware of this resource on our website products page. There's we're not the best at our website yet. We're still working on that. But we now have one member who's full-time with the business, so that's very exciting. And we have these PDFs, a sun loving one and a woodland one. If you've been out to our events, you've seen these. They are our boards that help people see what things look like when they're blooming. But we've organized them in a matrix for sun or shade, from moist to well-drained soil. And so you can take a look at those online. I tried to put my references in there throughout the program, but ones I forgot. And I want to mention the living landscape. If you like the idea of the ecosystem layers and using that as some of your design basis, Rick Dark and Doug Tallamy do a really good job in laying out that in the living landscape. With that, I'll open it up for questions. And I don't know if I need to do anything.
Jen, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And yeah, I think you're totally fine. But yeah, do you want to open it up for if anyone has questions? Jen, I can actually get us kicked off, and this is purely selfish. So I feel like we talked a lot. That was super informative, by the way. That was great. I really enjoyed that. Lot of conversation about ground covers, perennials, more of those kind of like flowering plants. Would you have any specific recommendations for dealing with soil around trees? Like, is there anything different that we need to take into consideration for soil around established trees?
That is a really good question. It really is an area that I haven't spent a lot of time in, but we do, it's one of those things that I've been kind of thinking about a lot, because we don't want to disturb roots, right, too much, but we also don't want to mow around them. So I think, in those cases, it's not a bad idea to have, maybe add a layer of compost, not, especially if some of the roots are exposed, to where you can maybe add and plant around them, maybe not even a whole circle around, but nestlings, it really depends on the situation. But, with native plants, there's a lot of shade plants. So I think, obviously black walnut trees, that's a whole nother game. But for them, you can have a successful garden under the trees. Obviously with, we talk about the ecosystem layering. So in that case, you're planting shrubs in between trees and understory, and tall perennials and low perennials. And so you're considering that. And a big reason to do that is because the different wildlife exists in those different layers. And the things going on that refeed the ecosystem are part of that whole system. Obviously, prairies are a little bit different, and they're special, and important as well. So, but that, dead plant material is still replenishing. So if you're improving your ability to not mow around the tree, you're fine. Adding a little bit of compost, but just not making it too deep. And then putting things, like that do well, such as, I just blinked out, wild geraniums, the anemones, your shade plants. In most cases, obviously, if your tree's out in the open, it may have a spot that's really close to full sun, if it's south facing. So all the way around a tree too, you may not have symmetry because of the sun requirements.
Well, and you kind of caught me there earlier. We actually have two very mature black walnut trees. So that is a whole different situation that I'm trying to deal with. So, but that's a whole other, I feel like that could be a whole hour in itself.
It totally could. Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to open it up to any other questions. I'm also going to take a look at the chat here. We do have one question coming in. What is a natural way to get rid of creeping Charlie?
Oh boy. Yeah. You're just throwing out all the hard ones, huh? And I'm trying to think, is creeping Charlie the one with the purple bloom? Because I know there's creeping Jenny, and there's the common names sometimes get me. I'm going to look it up on my phone really quickly just to make sure I'm commenting. But either way, one of them is a lot easier to pull, and one of them is not.
Okay.
I have creeping Jenny in my yard, and I don't even know what to do, to be honest, to begin to deal with that. But here's some of the things. So if your area has given up to that thing, you can go with it. You could just put obedient plant and things that spread, have higher foliage. Like even if it's a wetter area, things like I said, obedient plant, queen of the prairie that spreads would compete well with that. Or things that come up quickly, if it's a full sun area, you know, like the silphiums, cup plant, world rosinweed, those things do, you know, things that are tall and grow quickly. Wild bergamot can compete with that too. You may not be able to eradicate it, but if you have open areas, you might be able to try by doing like the lasagna plant, you know, lasagna gardening in some of those patches to keep it at least from being everywhere, you know, and then if your soil gets better, you can maybe start pooling it where it's coming up. So I'm doing that with passion flower, which is a native, but it totally took over this huge area. And I just pull it up where it comes up and keep it covered where, you know, where I have other things. So.
Awesome. So yeah, it sounds like it's kind of a multi-year plan is what you're doing there.
Well, yeah, and unfortunately with invasives, it is. I mean, it's not something you're going to accomplish overnight. I mean, if we could spray, and sometimes that's the case, you can, you know, have a reprieve for a little while, but things will come back in. You know, seed layer's still there, so you got to watch it until you get something else established. So
sure. We have another question coming in from the chat. This one's from Helen. I have clay soil. I have added amendments such as compost to the area, but it just sits on top of the clay. How do I work the amendments in without tilling, since we are told tilling soil is a no-no?
So, well, it depends on what the amendments are. If it's compost, they will eventually mingle, especially with plantings. A lot of the native plants have very deep root systems, and they help break that up and that active. So if it's compost, it will do its thing. Yeah, I understand. Like, we're all trying to change our mindset on this because I have a tiller too. And that's how I put in my wet meadow, and all of my garden beds, to be honest. But I'm just trying to challenge us all, including myself. So this is not a judgment at all on rethinking it. So if you're really struggling and it's just not working, go ahead and till it, you know, at least once, you know, and get that one layer, and then you should be able to add after that. If it's other things, like if you've tried to add sand on top of the compost or the clay, I read an article recently about that, but I can't remember a lot of the details except that it doesn't work. So you probably will have to try to till and maybe add some compost as well to try to help get those things to mingle. So yeah, there's a time and a place for tilling. If it's only going to be a one time, you know, don't feel guilty if that's the only way you can get it done, because we just got to take the opportunity to get the restoration done, right? I'm just encouraging people to try to consider taking it smaller and a little slower, so that you don't have to use these aggressive means that we may have a little guilt about, or concerns later, you know, if we learn more. But tilling isn't going to necessarily hurt anybody. It just may set your soil back just a little bit as far as the microbe community inside of it.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. As a fairly new novice gardener, it definitely feels like gardening in general, but also really trying to do, you know, native plant gardening and improve the biodiversity. It is a marathon. It is not a sprint. So this is an investment of time, and it is making me be very patient, and I hate that. So I am learning a lot of patience with this process.
Yes. And it's a good challenge for ourselves. Like, I try to reduce the insanity, you know, like I said, I tend to put these big beds in. And so I'm learning, you know, my 12 years of experience, hopefully I'll teach you something. But some of you are going to be just like me, just as hard-headed, and make these big beds and all this stuff. And it's okay. You know, if it goes to you know, weeds one year, you can recover it. That's why I ended up putting down all of that cardboard and mulch, because I'd planted stuff and they didn't thrive because they got covered in weeds. And I was like, what do I do now? You know, I can't till in between those plants because my tiller's too big, and you know, I shouldn't be doing that anyway. And I did lose a lot of soil. And in West Virginia, where I live, people, I should put this picture on my slide. The soil is clay, red clay, like Georgia soil. And so I think where I live, perhaps the topsoil layer is actually gone. So if you live in a hilly spot, that's always a possibility too. If your soil is super bad, you may just completely be missing that layer from poor previous management, you know, maybe 100 years ago, which is what happened here in West Virginia. a lot of clear cutting, a lot of erosion. And then, the Forestry Service started to take control and improve that. And they're still doing that. But yeah, it might be you don't have topsoil, which, that's very frustrating. But the good news is these plants are here. So as the clay, they were here together. They grew up together. They're interconnected. And if we use, the system that we're in, pick the plants for that system. And if we use, natural systems to fix it over time, it does get better. So.
Awesome. Fantastic. Okay, well, I'm going to just one last call here for any questions from our audience today. If you don't want to put it in the chat, feel free to come off mute and ask Jen your question directly. We'll just give everyone a second here if there's any last questions. Okay, I think that is it, Jen. So thank you again so much for your time. I just want to remind folks, Jen and her sister Sonia run Native Roots. Please check them out. This resource alone, I'll be honest with you, Jen, I was watching this presentation with my mom and my fiance kind of over my shoulder. And when you got to this slide and started talking about it, they were like, wow, this is super cool. So this is a really cool resource. And I think we're going to be bookmarking this page for sure.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you so much. And to everyone attending today, I know we had some folks who showed up a little later than our start time. We will be posting this full recording of this presentation on our website. And we will make sure that whenever that gets posted, we will include an update about that in our next chapter update. So if you're a chapter member of Wild Ones Greater Cleveland, you'll get that chapter update early next month. And if you're not, and you're interested in becoming a chapter member, we will be having an informational session this upcoming Monday, May 1st. If that's something that's interesting to you, please make sure you're following us on Facebook, or you can even email us directly for more information at wildonesgreatercleveland@gmail.com. And we would be happy to share that information with you. So Jen, thank you again for all of your knowledge, your work, your effort on this. We really appreciate your time. Please also express our appreciation to Sonia. I know she's also super helpful with this.
Yes.
And thank you for stepping up and volunteering to help us with this first session in our sort of novice gardener series. So thank you.
Yes, I'm looking forward to joining the others. And thank you all. Good luck.
Have a great night, everyone. Bye-bye.